I'm Mr. Upra. I'm going to teach today about heterogeneity testing. Guys, do you know anything about heterogeneity? Can you please define what is meant by heterogeneity?
I think heterogeneity is the opposite of homogeneity in the sense that it's when your data is varied and all your data is slightly different.
Artemis?
I think it's when the populations, the sample and the results of your study are quite different from each other.
That's a very good answer. So I think to combine both your thoughts, I'm going to say that it's a diversity and variation among the included studies in a meta-analysis that will contribute to heterogeneity. The more the diversity, more the heterogeneity. More variance, more the heterogeneity. How many types of heterogeneity does exist? Anybody?
I'm aware that there's 3 types, but I only know methodological heterogeneity.
That's a very good answer. There are 3 types of heterogeneity. One is a clinical heterogeneity, second one is methodological heterogeneity, third one is statistical heterogeneity. Clinical heterogeneity is nothing but diversity of the participants, diversity in the interventions, diversity in the outcomes. Participants could be sometimes ulcerative colitis patients and could be Crohn's patients. If you mix up both as an IBD, then it manifests as a clinical heterogeneity when you pool the outcomes. Same as with interventions. If you give one drug to one type of participants and give another drug to one type of other participants, then if you combine the outcomes, then it will manifest as a clinical heterogeneity. Similarly, methodological heterogeneity is because of different designs of the study. For example, some studies will have design of randomized controlled trials. Some design could be prospective, some could be retrospective. If you pull up various designs like RCTs, prospectives and retrospectives together, the outcomes will be different because there exists a selection bias, there exists the attrition bias, there exists the performance bias, there exists other types of bias like even reporting bias. So that's why the methodological heterogeneity does exist when you pull up different types of study designs. Are we clear on this methodological heterogeneity?
Not quite. So how does this risk of bias affect the heterogeneity?
When you have different study designs and when you pull up together, randomized controls studies will carry less risk of bias because of less risk of selection bias. Retrospective studies, there will be a selection bias. So an outcome that is coming from randomized controlled trials is not same as that of outcome coming from the retrospective studies. So if you pool the outcome from randomized controlled trials with that of retrospective studies, the pooled estimate does not represent actual estimate. There is a risk of bias combining different types of designs. So the risk of bias leading to different outcomes and wider confidence intervals, that is methodological heterogeneity. If you don't identify the heterogeneity, then comes statistical heterogeneity. So you have a very good participant cohort and you designed your study very well, but when you run the stats, the heterogeneity manifests as a values like I square or Q. That means that you have to go back and look for it. That is what is statistical heterogeneity. Statistical heterogeneity manifests as a part of statistical analysis.
Could you explain slightly more what you mean by it manifests itself?
Why I'm saying manifests itself rather than we can identify in hand before. The reason was when you think that all the participants and all the studies are similar without knowing that there can be selection bias and other things. So some study design could be prospective, some study design could be retrospective, and some studies design could be randomized controlled trials. So when you pool the outcomes, the outcome of the randomized trials is not same as the outcome of the retrospective studies. So the pooled estimates may assume the wider confidence interval and lack of precision and lack of accuracy. That comes as a higher Q value and higher I square with high standard deviation and variance. How to identify heterogeneity? If you look at the results, outcomes, pooled estimates, if you see the wider confidence intervals, that means there is a lack of precision. There exists some heterogeneity. Is there any way we can quantify heterogeneity? Yes. Simply, a screening test like chi-square test will give us a Q value. The bigger the Q, the higher the amount of heterogeneity. Bigger the Q, bigger the I square value. I square is equals to Q minus degrees of freedom by Q into 100%. So here in this formula you can see the I square and Q are directly related. If more number of studies are there, lesser the heterogeneity because it subtracts from Q. Let's say for example, if there are 10 studies, the degrees of freedom is 10 minus 1, which is 9 studies. So that means that there is an inverse relationship between degrees of freedom and I square, and there is a direct relationship between Q and I square. Are we clear on the Q and I square concept?
What exactly is Q and how is it related?
So Q is nothing but a statistical analysis using chi-square test. So as I said, the chi-square test is a screening test. So when you do chi-square test, so the Q is a manifestation of the difference between the observed values and expected values. So if there's a big difference between expected and observed values, then the bigger the Q. That means there is a lack of precision. The bigger the Q, bigger the I square. So that means that the Q is nothing but the difference between the expected outcomes and observed outcomes. What is the importance of this I square? Why we need to give a formula to I square? There is a reason for calculation of I square value. If the I square value comes between 0 to 40%, it may not be important if you're looking at single outcome, like for example sensitivity or specificity. If you're reporting two outcomes in a forest plot, both sensitivity and specificity, you have to consider a range of I square values. Anything between 30 to 60, if you're looking for two outcomes measures, then it will be considered as a moderate heterogeneity. Anything above 50% is substantial heterogeneity, 50 to 90% is substantial, and 75 to 100% is considerable heterogeneity.
So now that we have considerable heterogeneity, what should we do about it?
So that's a good
What
question,
should we do
Matthew.
about
When there is a considerable heterogeneity or substantial heterogeneity, we need to go back and look to see if we can reduce the heterogeneity. This flowchart explains how to address the heterogeneity. First of all, check if the data is correct. Try to explore heterogeneity. So what caused heterogeneity? Number one, is it clinical diversity or is it methodological diversity? Explore. Can you ignore heterogeneity? Not really. You should stop doing meta-analysis and address the issues first. Maybe you can address the issues by performing a random effects meta-analysis to see what comes out of it.
What is a random effects meta-analysis, and
What is
are there any
a
other
random
types
effects
of,
meta-analysis,
meta-analysis?
and are there any other
That's
types
very
of,
good question, Charlie.
meta-analysis?
So the random effects model assumes that all the studies included are different by default, whereas fixed effects model assumes that there is no difference among the included studies. So in random effects model, we are treating each study is different. We wanted to see how much I square value comes out of it when we do a pooled estimates. Other ways of addressing heterogeneity is change the effect measure. An effect measure could be something simple as like if you're looking like a pooled mortality rates. So you may not get same confidence intervals when you do a different type of effect measure. For example, you change the effect measure from mortality to that of R0 resection, the confidence intervals may become narrow or wider. So try to see if you can change pooled estimate of one type of measure to different type of measure. And if the confidence intervals become narrow and more precise, that means you can report that as a different measure, different pooled estimate. Sometimes you may not be able to do meta-analysis even if you change the effect measures. And finally, the only way is to exclude the studies which are contributing to heterogeneity by doing a box plot, 95% confidence box plot. If the studies fall outside 95% confidence box plot, those are the studies which are contributing to heterogeneity. If you remove the studies outside 95% confidence contour in a box plot, then you are able to substantially reduce the heterogeneity when you do pooled analysis. By excluding studies, you are losing some studies. You may not have that many studies left to do a pooled analysis. So that's the issue. But these are the common ways of addressing heterogeneity. You can see the flowchart. First of all, check if the data is correct and do not do a meta-analysis and explore the heterogeneity and do not ignore heterogeneity. Take it seriously and try to do a random effects model and change the effect measure wherever possible and exclude studies if you have lots of studies. This is a demo showing how to exclude the studies outside 95% confidence contour to reduce the heterogeneity. Here you can see this box plot. Within these are the studies outside the box plot and these are the studies within the box plot. So when I remove the studies outside the box plot, and this is the ROC curve. When I include studies both outside and inside the box plot, this is ROC curve. The pooled estimate effect measure is changing when you exclude outside box plot and when you include all the studies together. So that means that the effect measure is changing when you remove the studies outside the box plot. That means now it is more precise estimate. Instead of getting into troubles with heterogeneity, we should actually investigate heterogeneity prior to doing a meta-analysis. One of the best way is to select random effects models. So before I go in depth about these, anybody in the group, do you know what you mean by random effects model?
Yeah, I think random effects model is when we assume that the studies are different to each other. Random effects model is when we assume that the studies
That's
are
correct.
different
You
to
know,
each
in
other.
random effects
Whereas
model,
fixed
there are
effect
no
is when we
assumptions.
assume that the studies
Each
are the same.
study
That's correct.
is different from other study. So where we have no assumptions, both in input variables as well as outcomes. But whereas in fixed effect model, we assume that all studies have similar outcomes and similar type of participants. So in random effects model, we assume that each study design is different, each study outcomes are also slightly different from each other, so that the statistical software is going to perform and give us I square and Q value. When you use random effect model, automatically the software gives you how much is I square and how much is a Q value. Even before jumping into I square and Q value, just by looking at the tau square concept, which is very important, tau is nothing but estimated standard deviation. The higher the variance, higher the heterogeneity.
Can you explain how heterogeneity and tau are linked?
Tau is nothing but estimated standard deviation.
Can you explain
So
how
when there is a
heterogeneity and tau are linked?
huge standard deviation, that means that there are wider confidence intervals. That means that the pooled estimates have assumed wider confidence intervals. That means that the estimate is not precise in the first instance. So when the estimate is not precise with the wider confidence intervals, there is a huge standard deviation, there is a high tau value. When there is a high tau value, the tau square automatically is high, which is nothing but variance. So when the variance is high, there are wider confidence intervals, which also means that the Q and I square that comes out of calculations will also be high. So indirectly, just by looking at the tau value, you can say that if you do calculations for I square and Q, you get high I square and Q. So that's how the variance, tau square, is linked to heterogeneity. So when you get heterogeneity, the next step is to do something called interaction and effect modification. We need to look at what are the input variables and what are the outcome measures you are looking at it. Can we drop some input variables to see if there's any difference in the confidence intervals of the estimates? Can we change the outcome measures altogether? For example, instead of estimating pooled mortality figures, you may look at pooled R0 resections. Like that, you can change both input variables as well as outcome measures. So that is something called interaction and effect modification. But you can't do all this all the time because you may not have that many input variables, or you may not have that many outcome measures reported in the studies. The next step is to do a subgroup analysis or a better regression.
What is meant by subgroup analysis?
The subgroup analysis is nothing but dividing the included studies
What is,
into
meant by
homogeneous groups of
subgroup analysis?
interventions and outcomes. The best example I can give is, if you're looking at the pooled mortality rates, you can divide the studies which contain ITU admissions data separately with that of non-ITU patients data, because the ITU admissions have different outcome compared to non-ITU admissions. Therefore, you can't do pooled estimates. Instead, you divide them into ITU and non-ITU subgroups. The subgroup analysis allows us to divide into homogeneous groups and compare the outcomes. But sometimes, even though you divide into subgroups, you may still have inherent heterogeneity. That's because of the bigger Q. We need to look at Q even though we are doing subgroup analysis. Let's say, for argument's sake, we got Q value of 1. That means it's ideal, you don't have inherent heterogeneity. That means you can even do subgroup analysis as little as with 2 studies. So let's say if you got Q value of 100, then you need more degrees of freedom to reduce the inherent I square or heterogeneity value. So the more degrees of freedom in the equation, I square equals to Q minus degrees of freedom divided by Q into 100%, you can see that the more degrees of freedom, lesser the heterogeneity. So although you may have Q, big Q, But if you have more degrees of freedom, there is a less inherent heterogeneity. That means you can perform subgroup analysis if you have more degrees of freedom. But unfortunately, you may not have plenty of studies to do subgroup analysis when you encounter higher Q value. So what is the next step then? You end up doing a meta-regression, which is more effective and alternate way to test the cause and effect relationship. Before doing subgroup analysis and meta-regression is a selection of studies. So we need to select adequate number of studies for subgroup analysis and meta-regression.
So approximately how many studies will this actually be?
So ideally we need a minimum
approximately
of
how
4
many
number of studies,
studies will
because
this
a
actually
lot of the
be?
time we never get Q below 10. So it will always be Q value will be most of the time we do analyze. The Q statistic value will be about 10. So ideally we need at least a minimum 4 studies so that the inherent heterogeneity will be less. So for all practical purpose, anything below 4 studies, we should ideally have a less Q value. Although I said earlier that even with 2 studies you can do subgroup analysis, but only if and only if the Q is very small. I wanted to ask you guys, what type of studies are you going to include in the subgroup analysis?
So I think these will be studies with similar interventions, sort of similar outcomes, and also similar time frames.
So I think what do you mean by time frame?
Similar interventions.
So
I mean,
similar
sort
outcomes,
of, if they've been
and
conducted
also
within the
similar
same,
timeframes.
say, 5 or 10 year period, because you can't really compare a study that's been conducted.
So I mean,
50 years ago, with
if
one
they've
that was
been conducted
this
within
year,
the
so as long as
same,
they've
say,
been
5 or
conducted
10 year
within a similar
period,
timeframe.
because you can't really
That's
compare a
that's
study
precise
that's been
answer.
conducted
You can't compare the
50
data
years ago with one that was
published
conducted
earlier
this year, so
before
as long as they've been
laparoscopic
conducted
era
within a similar
and
timeframe.
after laparoscopy invention or robotic invention. We can only compare the studies published within last 10 years with similar interventions and similar outcomes reported. You need to specify the characteristic in advance which you're going to include in subgroup analysis. For example, what are the input variables and how many? Try to minimize as minimum as possible. Select small number of study characteristics. And also never select input variables which has confounding effect. The best example I can give is you can't combine smoker with a COPD. A smoker is one characteristic. The COPD is a different characteristic. So if you input both to compare the outcomes within subgroup, both smoking and COPD will have confounding effect. That's why when you do subgroup analysis, you have to select minimum number of characteristics possible which do not have confounding effect. To summarize, we need at least 4 studies and as little characteristics as possible, and the characteristics which have less confounding effect you have to pull before you run subgroup analysis. Now I would like to demonstrate subgroup analysis. In this subgroup analysis, I would like to demonstrate the cause and effect relationship between higher ASA and lower ASA with that of mortality. Here, the subgroups is nothing but the patients admitted into ITU. So all the studies which are shown here in this table, the participants all of them are admitted into ITU, irrespective of type of operation. Here you can see the number of characteristics are just ASA and gender. So I would like to demonstrate the relationship between higher ASA and mortality. Mortality is a dependent variable here. The ASA grade is independent variable and gender is independent variable here. In this regression equation, you can see the higher ASA has got significant p-value with the mortality as the outcome measure. Here the mortality is dependent variable, ASA grades are independent variables. When you do a regression equation between higher ASA and mortality, so you can see the p-value is significant and t-score is high. Whereas if you do subgroup analysis between low ASA and the mortality, you can see the p-value is not significant and t-scores are not significant. So therefore, if you select little number of characteristics in a subgroup analysis, you can actually demonstrate cause and effect relationship. Here, these subgroups are considered as homogeneous because all the patients are admitted into ITU irrespective of their comorbidities and irrespective of type of operation they are undergone. Now I would like to do a demonstration of meta-regression. Before we go into meta-regression, we need to set a model. Unlike subgroup analysis where you can do a regression equation, in the meta-regression you need to define the model first. We should have 3 variables in each group. Number 1 is total number of participants, and number 2 is the groups which you want to test the difference, and number 3 is what will be the standard deviation that you would like to look at between the 2 groups. I selected the metaset model here as a total number of participants in studies as a first column, and then I selected total number of high ASA as a second column. And then I selected standard deviation of the mortality as a standard deviation of the outcome measure. So I'm declaring this as a metaset model. So here I'm comparing whether there is a relationship between total number of patients, higher ASA grade, and mortality. The higher the mortality, higher the deviation, and the outcome is bad. As simple as that. So I'm pulling all the studies which has got total number of patients onto one column, and then higher ASA patients, and then mortality. This is my metaset. Now, having declared this metaset model, now I'm going to run the equation. This is outcome. You can see this meta-regression equation, although has got high I-square value, we ignore the I-square here. We look at the model value, R-square model. If the model is above 50%, it is acceptable model. If the p-values are significant, it is acceptable. So here, we ignore the heterogeneity. You can see there is a cause and effect relationship. The higher ASA is automatically linked to higher mortality and p-value is significant. Whereas low ASA, if I use the lower ASA instead of higher ASA as an input variable, then the mortality figure doesn't seem to be associated or related. There is no cause and effect relationship. That means that higher ASA is clearly linked to mortality. Obviously, this is a meta-regression giving all the characteristics written here. I-square, R-square, p-value, function change. So even the tau square as well. So in a meta-regression, you can get all the characteristics which you also get in meta-analysis, whereas we ignore some things here. One is I-square. We ignore I-square because it's a fixed effect model. And we also take some of the things into account, which is R-square and also p-value and function change. Here we got subgroup analysis and meta-regression results. Charlie, how will you interpret this subgroup analysis and meta-regression results?
So I think when you analyse the meta-regression, you don't take into account the I-squared, it's just the R-squared and the p-value, so you ignore heterogeneity.
That's correct.
I think,
so you ignore the heterogeneity when you do subgroup
meta-regression,
analysis and
you don't take into account
meta-regression.
the I-squared,
So that means
it's
that
just
if the
the
R-squared
R-squared
value is
and
above
p-value, so you ignore
50%,
heterogeneity.
that means that you're able to establish cause and effect relationship. Is it same as meta-analysis, Artemis?
I don't think it is, because we don't take into consideration the I-squared value.
That's correct. We ignore the heterogeneity in both subgroup analysis and meta-regression. That means that we are mainly focusing on establishing cause and effect relationship. So here we can't really do a pooled estimates or pooled outcome measures, but at least we can prove a cause and effect relationship. For example, is male gender associated with higher mortality, or is it higher ASA patients have got higher mortality? That kind of cause and effect relationship we can prove with subgroup analysis and meta-regression. To be precise, subgroup of comparisons are observational mainly. We specify the outcome measures prior to analysis, and we would like to see if there is any direct evidence that supports cause and effect relationship. Although we cannot measure the magnitude of the effect, but we can prove at least there is a relationship between cause and effect. So if there is a statistical significant difference between subgroups, then automatically there is a cause and relationship we can establish. We can also establish cause and relationship within the study as well as between the studies. A subgroup analysis and meta-regression is the last mode of approach when you can't do meta-analysis and when you can't do pooled estimates or pooled outcome measures, when you can't display because of higher heterogeneity. The only solution is either subgroup analysis or meta-regression. Having seen the results of subgroup analysis and meta-regression, you all know that when you got heterogeneity, you can't do a meta-analysis. Obviously, we need to identify the sources of heterogeneity. One of the biggest sources of heterogeneity is baseline risk, like for example, age and severity of the disease process. Age, as the older generation is included in analysis, the more the baseline risk. Similarly, the severe the disease process, more the baseline risk is. We also got something called control group risk as well, apart from baseline risk.
What is control group risk?
Control group risk is nothing but risk that is inherited because of random disease process. For example, you may think that you have included healthy subjects as
control group risk?
but you may have atherosclerosis, which is not manifested clinically and it may be subclinical. That means that there is a risk with this type of control group, which is called control group risk. The longer the length of the follow-up, higher the control group risk. Similarly, there is a dose-response relationship as well. So especially if you're doing a crossover trials, if you're switching one drug to other, there is something called carryover effect from previous intervention, which will be carried over when you switch from one drug to other. So which is also called intervention effect. To summarize, there is a baseline risk, there is a control group risk, and also there is an intervention effect as well, which is dose and duration dependent. Therefore, we always have to do risk ratios, odds ratios, and risk differences prior to doing meta-analysis. Finally, to conclude the session, I would like to say, when you want to do summary statistics, you always try to do summary statistics with characteristics that do not inherit or contribute to baseline risk. So in a meta-analysis, ideally, we need to have a summary statistics that show no relationship with baseline risk. These are the ideal for meta-analysis.